probably get started. So I wanted to thank you for joining us tonight to hear more about the work of the Xerces Society and how to create your own pollinator garden. My name is Juliet Bender, and I am president of the OSU Lane County Master Gardener Association. And I'd like to welcome you to our monthly seminar series, which are held the third Tuesday of the month at 6:30. All of these seminars are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. Questions will be handled at the end of the talk, but feel free to put any questions in the Q&A box at any time. And I would encourage you to put them in the Q&A. It's just easier to find them if they're in that Q&A box. And Jan Gano, vice president of our group, will coordinate these questions at the end. And also for this talk, closed captioning is available. It can be turned on or off with the CC button on your screen. So I think that's all the housekeeping issues for now. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, who is Matthew Shepard, who is the Director of Outreach and Education at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation in Portland, Oregon. Matthew spent more than 35 years working with people from all walks of life to create better places for wildlife. He's worked for the Xerces Society for 2 decades, initially helping to lead the national effort to protect pollinators, but now focused on community engagement and conservation in towns and cities. Matthew is the author of numerous articles and the co-author of several books, including Attracting Native Pollinators and Gardening for Butterflies. He learned gardening at his mother's side and has created and maintained wildlife gardens everywhere he has lived. So tonight, he will introduce you to the diversity and natural history of Oregon's native bees and present straightforward ways in which you can make your garden a pollinator haven. Before I turn it over to Matthew, I'd also like to provide some additional information about a seminar that's going on. It's sponsored by Oregon State University. It's a free webinar series entitled Pollinator Habitat 101, an introduction and refresher. It's live on Friday mornings at 7 a.m. Yes, 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So it's pretty early for us, but it is recorded, fortunately. So you can listen to it after the fact. And I think Jet is going to put, yes, she has. Jet has put in the chat box a link to this webinar. And Matthew, our speaker tonight, it will be part of this series, and he will be speaking on November 4th. So if you're very interested in more information after tonight, be sure to register for that series as well. So now let me turn the program over to Matthew, and thank you, Matthew, so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Juliet, and thank you to Lane County Master Gardeners for inviting me to come here tonight. Or come, I mean, it's a throwback to the old days when I actually used to travel and go places, but now I can do it from the without having to travel, which has its advantages, but I always really enjoy being in the room and actually really meeting people face to face. So anyway, I'm going to be talking this evening about pollinators, specifically about native bees. It was really interesting to see the people's favorite pollinators as they were putting them into the chat there. It's great to see that people are aware that there's more than just like honeybees or bumblebees. So I mean, to see flies as the first suggestion, that was a real thrill. But as I say, I'm going to be talking about native bees. I'll be focused on trying to introduce you to the diversity of native bees, and just in Oregon, which sometimes people find staggering. Talk about some of their habitat needs, you know, what they need, how they think about it, or live within a landscape, and then talk about some of the principles and strategies that you can apply to any location, and then wrap up with some resources at the end. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to sit here and give you like a kind of a recipe. You know, I'm not going to give you a specific list of things that you can do, because I mean, you're gardeners, and so therefore, you know, you'll know that every garden is different. You know, the soils, you know, is it clay or is it sand or is it loam? Is it wet or is it dry? Is it sunny? Is it shady? Is it exposed to the wind or is it not exposed? And there's so many different variations and variables in between gardens that there's no way that I can cover the specifics. But what I would like to do is to give you an introduction to bees so that you can go out and look at a landscape, look at a garden, you know, your community garden, your neighborhood, whatever scale you're looking, and be able to have a sense of what a bee would need to live successfully within that landscape. And so it's a way to get you thinking. I will share my screen because I do have a presentation for this evening. Hopefully you can now all see that, and so I will plow ahead.
It looks great. It looks great, Matthew.
Great, that's good to know. And as I was saying in the introduction, at the end there will be a Q&A, and so I'm going to talk for a while, and then I will hang around. Hopefully I'll be able to answer all your questions by the end. So who are the Xerces Society? We are an environmental nonprofit. We are based in Portland. We actually have just celebrated our 50th anniversary. That was last year, because we were founded in 1971 by Robert Michael Pyle, who is a lepidopterist, a butterfly researcher, speaker, award-winning writer, and so on. And many of you may well know of him. But we were named for the Xerces blue butterfly, which is one of the first butterflies known to go extinct in North America because of human activity. Our mission is to protect the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. But at the most basic level, we want to stop further extinctions. We want to try and prevent more butterflies, more insects and other invertebrates going extinct. And the photograph here, this is a page from the only book that I know of from the era, the butterfly book, from the time when the Xerces blue was actually living and you could find it. And it was from John Comstock's Butterflies of California, which was published in 1927, which was about 16 years before the butterfly went extinct. It used to live in the San Francisco Peninsula, and as the city of San Francisco and surrounding cities expanded, all of its habitat disappeared, and it was last seen flying in 1943. So the Xerces Society, we are, I say, an environmental nonprofit. We work through hands-on conservation by actually trying to create habitat on the ground, because in the end, if we're not changing conditions on the ground, you know, in gardens, in parks, on roadsides, on farms, you know, in wild areas and natural areas and so on, if we're not changing the conditions there and making them better for insects, other invertebrates and wildlife, then we're not doing the fundamental work. So we partner with all sorts of individuals and organizations. Xerces Society, we do not own land, so we don't have reserves like, say, the Nature Conservancy does. So we're working in partnership with people who do have land, whether that's a gardener or a park manager or a farmer or, you know, a public land manager. And although we're always trying to maintain positive relationships with people, there are times when we have to stand up and say, no, you know, you shouldn't do that. So we are directly involved with advocacy, and most of that is focused on protection of rare and endangered species. You may have heard about the rusty patch bumblebee, which is the only bee in the continental United States that is protected under the United States Endangered Species Act. That gained that protection thanks to our efforts. We also are involved with research. We are an evidence-based, science-based organization. So we like to make sure that all the advice we give, all the management plans we create, all the habitats that we help people plant, you know, all of that is backed up by evidence. So there's a reason for why we're saying something or why we're doing something. And so in addition to having networks of scientists in universities across this, you know, this country and in other countries who are helping to provide information and make sure that we're accurate, we also are involved directly with research itself, whether that's figuring out the best way to prepare a site for seeding a new meadow using organic methods, for example, or doing fundamental life history research to understand the needs of the species we're trying to work with. And then we do education, publications, talks, webinars, social media, all these things, because in the end, the more people we can get involved who are individually or collectively changing the landscape to improve it for invertebrates, the better the planet will be. And the Xerces Society, I mean, I've now worked here for more than 20 years. And when I started working here, it was just a handful of people. I think it was literally just 5 people. And now we're 75 people, I think, which is a huge growth in that period of time. But as an organization, we're much bigger than just the staff, because we have nearly 14,000 members scattered around in a dozen or more different countries. We have ambassador volunteers who give up their time to willingly help us with outreach. We have hundreds, thousands of community science volunteers who are working to gather data. We partner with foundations and businesses. I mean, yes, we get money from them, but we're also working with them to, you know, some of the businesses are agricultural interests, so we're transforming their agricultural landscapes. We have the scientists that we work with, we have the land managers that we work with, and we, of course, just regular folks who want to do something in their neighborhood. All of that goes up to make Xerces into a much bigger, much more impactful organization than simply the staff. So what I'm really here to talk about this evening, and the thing that I can so easily get just all nerdy about, pollinators, specifically bees, because they're such fantastic, beautiful, amazing, fascinating animals. So the diversity of pollinators, and I'm not going to dive into what pollinators do, because I think you probably understand that pollinators are moving pollen within flowers or between flowers on different plants, and in doing that, fertilizing those flowers. And from that, we get food and we get seed for the next generation of plants, and you know, the wildlife gets food. But who are the pollinators doing that? Well, there are all sorts of pollinators, and some of the answers in the question in the chat at the beginning hint at that. These are the major groups of insects that are pollinators, but yes, bats pollinate. There are, I believe, 2 species of bats in this country that help pollinate sagurai cacti and some other plants in the desert southwest. There's also at least 1 species of dove that helps pollinate desert plants. There are the hummingbirds. In our region, there are two the most commonly encountered hummingbirds, Annas and the rufous, but there are other species around. There are elsewhere in the world, there are big mammals, you know, squirrels and rodents and lemurs in Madagascar. So all sorts of pollinators, but the bulk of the pollinators are very small animals, are insects. And the major pollinator groups that we have in this country are butterflies and moths, together the Lepidoptera. And they obviously are going to flowers to drink nectar, and in passing through the flowers, the pollen gets stuck to them. We also have flies, not all flies, but quite a good number of flies are flower visitors, and whilst there, they either are looking for warmth or a mate or food, and in the time they spend in the flowers, they're moving pollen around. It's the same with beetles. There's an example of a beetle on the lower left there. Again, not all beetles, but the beetles that do visit flowers pollinate, and they may not be the most effective or efficient pollinators, because sometimes they go to the flower and they're actually eating the flower, which seems like not very good for the flower, but the pollen gets moved around, and so they are effective pollinators. And in desert areas, beetles are probably more significant for pollinators than they are in the temperate areas where we live. And then we get to the key group of pollinators, the Hymenoptera, which together include wasps. Yes, despite everything we might think about yellow jackets and hornets, wasps are really important insects and can be pollinators. And then bees. And bees are considered to be the most important single group of pollinators in the temperate zone. And they have three distinct behaviors that make them so significant. They actively collect and transport pollen. Most of the insects visiting the flowers, and that's not what they're not doing it on purpose. They're going there for all sorts of other reasons. But in visiting flowers, the pollen gets stuck to them, and then they move on to a different flower. But bees are actively collecting and transporting pollen, which means that they are moving a lot of pollen very efficiently. They also forage in a relatively limited area around the nest, because they're collecting the pollen and nectar as well to take back to their nest to feed their offspring. And so they're constantly going out. They go from the nest, they go out and they forage, and then they go back to the nest, and they go out and they forage, and they go back to the nest, and they forage and go back to the nest. So they work the area around the nest very efficiently. And they also have something that we refer to as flower constancy. And that means that once they visit a flower of one species, they will go to another flower of that same species. And so the pollen is being very accurately moved from flower to flower. Other pollinators are not necessarily doing that. So there's a lot more chance involved with pollination by butterflies and moths or flies or beetles. But the bees are going from flower to flower to flower, the same species. But it's still chance. The bees are not getting up in the morning and going, gosh, I must go out and pollinate. They're going out to feed their offspring. And so the pollination is still by chance. They're very efficient at moving pollen, but some of it, and you can see on this photograph of the bumblebee here, the pollen's on its back leg, but you'll see the white pollen grain elsewhere in its body. And that's enough pollen to transfer from one flower to another. Honeybees probably are the bee that we frequently first think of. If you say bee, many people think of honeybees and honeycomb and those large hives and the queen and the worker bees and the division of labor and all of that. But honeybees are really not a typical bee. They might be kind of the stereotypical bee, but they're not the typical bee. They are a really unusual bee in many respects. There aren't other bees that really live in such a big colony or make honey or make honeycomb or will live in a box that you can move around so easily. But also the honeybee is not native to this continent. It was brought in by probably by European settlers, and the earliest record that we have of honeybees arriving on a ship is in the 1620s. And back then, everybody would have a honeybee hive in their backyard, a little skep, because honey was a really important source of sugar, either for sweetening or was really important for brewing alcohol. So it had lots of uses, and honey was also would use for sealing and preserving food, and the wax was really valuable. So there were lots of reasons for having honeybees. but it wasn't pollination. But now the honeybee is primarily known for, honey supplies and also as a crop pollinator. And the honeybee is phenomenally important to our commercial agriculture as it is today. They are beset by diseases and pests and poisoning from insecticides and low nutrition because our landscapes are impoverished, and there's lots of problems that honeybees are facing. But despite all you might see in the media about honey being endangered, the honeybees are not endangered. We still have, and the number I have here is from a few years ago, but it essentially has remained unchanged. And if not, it may actually have gone up a little bit, but we still have 2.7, 2.8 million hives in this country, and they're still able to pollinate crops. So moving away from the honeybee and looking at our native bees, when you start looking at just the number of species, North America, and that's from, that includes Canada and Mexico and the Caribbean, and so it's the entire continent. There's more than 5,000 species of bees in this continent. Just within the United States, we have more than 3,600. Within Oregon, the best estimate is between 600 and 800, and there is from Oregon State University, there's the Oregon Bee Project and the Bee Atlas, which is trying to quantify this. And the last I heard, they'd got 650 species that have been confirmed and identified in Oregon, and I think and that was a year ago, so I'm sure it's now higher. But we're thinking there's probably something close to 800 species in this state. And if you could narrow it down to a city and then down to a garden, I mean, a city would have 100 plus species of bees, and a garden could easily have 30 or 40 species of bees. And that number is based upon my own garden, because I'm geeky enough to be looking more closely and keeping a record of the species, or at least the diversity. And so I have more than 3 dozen species of bees in my own garden, and it's a 50-foot by 100-foot plot in the suburbs with a house in the middle of it, so it's not a big area. But I also know of one garden, there's a research being done by Gail Lungoletto from Oregon State, and she's found more than 80 species of bees in one garden in Portland, which is quite remarkable. So what do these bees need in their landscape? I want to look a little bit at natural history to give you a sense of who they are and what they're doing. Because, and again, I can't tell you exactly what you should do in your garden, but hopefully if you can have a sense of what bees need, then you'll be able to look at your own garden and figure out whether you have what they need. So the basic life cycle of a bee, it's like so many insects, and indeed like butterflies that many of us know. You have an adult, you have an egg, you have the larvae, you have the pupa, and then it goes back to the adult. And so for most of our native bees, this cycle takes a whole year. The majority of our bees are solitary, so one female is making her own nest. There's no sharing of work. She's not got anybody to help her dig or make the nest or forage and collect the pollen. And so one female is making her own nest. And in this example, it's a ground nesting bee, a mining bee. And so she will live for 3 or 4 weeks. In that time, we'll be making a series of brood cells underground. You've got a photograph on the right-hand side there. She's excavated this tiny little cell, and in this case, the cell is about 3/4 of an inch, maybe an inch tall. She supplies it with nectar and pollen. Then you get to the lower part here, and you see there's an egg, a kind of a sausage-shaped egg. She lays the egg on top of that food supply, and then she seals the nest, and she will never actually meet her offspring. But the egg hatches after a few days or a week. The egg will hatch. The larvae will eat that food, that she's provided, and it will take about 10 days, 2 weeks of eating, and then it will transform into the pupa, into this dormant state, and it will remain in the brood cell for the rest of that year, and will emerge at the same season that its parent bee was active. Now, so about 70% of our bees are ground nesting. So, you know, in the US, that means about 2,500 species of bees are ground nesting, almost entirely solitary. And they will dig into the ground. They don't need a lot of space, but they just need to get access to the ground. And some of them will dig 4 or 6 inches down. Some will go down, you know, 8, 10, 12, 18, 24 inches down. And depending on the species, it will either be fairly simple or incredibly complex. And you may not notice these, but all you'll see is tiny little holes, you know, 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch in diameter, and sometimes a mound of soil around it. And sometimes to spot this, you just have to spend time sitting there, peering at the ground, going, what's that little hole? And, you know, sit there and watch it and see what happens. Other times, and the photograph there of the grass, you can see all the mounds from the bees. This is a mining bee site, and there were about 50,000 bees nesting in a single aggregation, just a large area of about, well, it was somebody's, you know, somebody's backyard orchard, so an area of about 30 feet by 50 feet, and we figured there was about 50,000 bees nesting, 20 or 30 individual bees nesting per square foot. Most of the rest of our bees, also solitary, they are nesting in a tunnel, an existing tunnel. And in that I include, you know, mason bees that we know are well known now, leafcutter bees. Where you are in Lane County, strangely, it's a little unusual, but you may have large carpenter bees that will actually chew out their own tunnel. And they go down the pithy stem of something like elderberry or raspberry or a rotting piece of pine. And these bees, they find a tunnel and they divide that tunnel into a series of brood cells. Leafcutter bees neatly trim pieces of leaf, and that drawing on the top there is a leafcutter bee cross section. Make these little brood cells completely enclosed in neatly trimmed pieces of leaf. Food supply, egg, seal it, and make another one down the end of the tunnel. The lower one is a cross section of a mason bee, and you'll see the walls there made out of wet soil and mud. And again, the food supply, the egg, and then seal the cell. And those will go through the same life cycle that I was showing you for the mining bee, but then will emerge and are able to dig out down the length of that tunnel through one cell after another to get out. And these bees, they need the nesting material. So sometimes it's leaf pieces, sometimes it's soil, resin, small pebbles, wet mud, all sorts of different materials that they might use, and different species use slightly different materials. This photograph shows a leafcutter bee, and you can see that piece of leaf that it's trimmed. It has very strong jaws, and it just trims its way around, and you'll sometimes see these little semicircular, almost circular pieces trimmed out of rose leaves or redbud in particular. Those are preferred ones. And to illustrate the fact that there's no simple thing with such diversity of bees, I had said that leafcutter bees nest down a tunnel, typically in a tree. Well, they do, but then there are some that nest in the ground. And so there's no absolutes. You can't say, this is what this bee do and this is what this bee does, because with so many species, there's all sorts of different variations and gradations. There's no black and white. Everything seems to be grayness. And then we have bumblebees, and bumblebees are the most frequently encountered social bee, and they do live in a colony. It's not like a honeybee colony. They don't make honeycomb, but they do make little waxen balls, and you can see in the photograph on the right-hand side there, those little ball-shaped things. Those are the waxy cells that the larvae and the pupae are reared in. They don't have castes exactly, but the queen overwinters and founds the colony in the late winter, early spring. And she starts the colony as a solitary bee. And then her first brood of her offspring, once they have hatched out, then they will help with the foraging and the tending of the nest. And gradually over the next 3 or 4 months, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, depending on species, there'll be a few more broods. And the most nests probably won't have more than a few dozen bumblebees in it by the end of the summer, but there are some that could have 200 or 300. And then at the end of summer, that last brood of offspring, you'll have some males and you'll have the new queens that come out and will then go into hibernation at the end of summer. Most of the bees in the nest die. And the kind of places where bumblebees will nest, probably amongst their favorite spots are like abandoned chipmunk nests or mouse nests, something that's small and warm and sheltered. And so they look underneath tumbled down grass. They'll be looking in little holes. They'll be under twig piles, all sorts of nice chaotic places that you need. And then obviously bees do need flowers. They do need the flowers, the nectar and the pollen. Many species of bees are generalists and will take nectar and pollen from any plant they can. But there are some, and about 1/4 of our species are fairly specialized, sometimes just in a small number of closely related flowers, but then there are some species of bees that will take pollen from only a single species of flower. And that's why diversity of flowers in our landscapes is so important, and why we should also be focusing on native plants. So that was a bit about the natural history and the kind of what they need. And I'm now going to go through fairly quickly just to give you an idea of some of the bees that you'll be coming across in your in your landscapes, gardens, parks, golf courses, wherever you might be. I'm going through roughly in the kind of order you might start seeing them from late winter. And around here, late winter, bumblebees are coming out in sometimes late January, but more typically kind of mid-February. I normally see my first bumblebees consistently in the 3rd week of February, where I live in the Portland area. And I think we probably will all recognize a bumblebee when we see one. It's big, it's hairy, it's yellow and black, but inevitably with so many, it's not all yellow and black. There are some that are orange, there are some that are mostly black with a bit of white on them. But generally bumblebees don't fit what we think a bee should look like. They live in colonies. They are, the big ones are more than 1 inch long, but the worker bees, the first brood of bees, are much smaller. And so you will see, bees of the same species will be dramatically different in size. They do carry their pollen as a wet lump on their rear leg. That's another way that helps you identify them. And they will be active from late winter, so from February all the way through to late fall. So you can see bumblebees are active in October and sometimes in November when the weather's nice. Another bee that comes out early in the year are the mining bees. These can be about the same size as a honeybee, so 1/2 inch, maybe nearly 3/4 inch long, but they're pretty nondescript. They don't really have stripes. They're not really bright colors. They're typically a dark brown or a black. So sometimes these are buzzing around and we're not really noticing them. But if you do get close, you'll see, and the photographs on the right-hand side give you a sense that they carry a massive amount of pollen on their legs, and they carry it dry. Most bees just have a specialized patch of hairs either on their hind legs or on the underside of their body where they carry pollen. And the mining bees carry their pollen really high up their leg. And you can see, particularly in that lower right photo, that it goes all the way up to the body. Then we have mason bees. people, you can buy mason bee blocks, you can buy mason bees themselves nowadays. And frequently people have dismissed these when they see them because I think that they look like a housefly because they're kind of a shiny dark blue color. But they're fatter than a housefly. And if you look at them, you'll see they carry pollen on the underside of their body. And inevitably, if you see, what looks like a housefly that's blocking off a tunnel with mud, then you've got mason bees, because they're called mason bees because of the walls they build to divide their tunnels. And having said that, most of them are the kind of a dark color or shiny blue. There are some mason bees that are bright green. So through the summer, you'll see different species of mason bees, and so be aware that you will also come across not just the early spring dark ones that we associate with orchards and mason bee blocks that you can purchase, but later in the summer you'll also find the other species. Then there's striped sweat bees. Again, these are fairly big, not quite as big as a honeybee, half an inch or more long, relatively drab, nondescript, but they, unlike the mining bees, they do have distinct stripes of pale hairs on their body. These are one of the bees that are also ground nesting and are relatively abundant. They're a bee that's fairly flexible, fairly adaptable, and able to survive in the degraded landscapes that we have. So you will find these in most places you go. You also get small sweat bees, and these can be tiny, 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 a tenth of an inch, an eighth of an inch, quarter of an inch long. And, again, nothing distinctive about them. They're not striped, they're just dark. But again, if you look closely, and sometimes you just sort of kind of see the movement and you don't realize that what it is. But you look closer and you begin to see, because they're still carrying that pollen on their hind leg. And you also, another sweat bee, but the fabulous, beautiful metallic green sweat bees. Again, kind of close to the size of a honeybee, but bright metallic green. The males are black and yellow stripes, sometimes black and white stripes on the rear part of their body, on their abdomen, but this fabulous gold and green on the front part. And these are relatively common, so you will find them in your gardens, in your parks, in your neighborhoods. And they are ground nesting, and you've got a photograph there of one of them popping out of its nest. The small carpenter bees, they're called carpenter bees because they are able to chew out their own nest, but it needs to be really soft, an elderberry stem or a broken raspberry stem, something like that. And you'll see the photograph on the lower right, that's of one of these small carpenter bees working away at its nest. But they are tiny. Most of the ones we see around here are a quarter of an inch, not much more than that. Sometimes they can get to more than half an inch long, but that's fairly unusual to ever see one that large. They are just super shiny, and they look a bit like a shiny wine bottle in some respects, with this dark green metallic color and a rather blunt body. But they are, again, fairly abundant, and you'll see them in the summer in particular. We have leafcutter bees, another bee that's striped, like the striped sweat bees, but most of them are very robust. They have this really stocky look to them, and many of them also have a pointed tip to their abdomen. And they also carry their pollen on the underside of their body, and you can see the two photographs of the bees. One of them, you can see the mass of pollen peeking out from around the edge of its body, and the other one just neatly on the underside. And these are the ones that cut these really neatly trimmed pieces of leaf to make their nests. And so that's a photograph of a redbud on the lower right there, showing you what the leaf trimmings look like. Because sometimes you'll see evidence of bees without necessarily seeing the bees themselves. We have longhorn bees, and they're so-called longhorn because of the extraordinary long antennae that the males have. The females don't have such a long antennae, so you see the main photograph there is female, but sometimes they're known as teddy bear bees because they're really cute and hairy, and you can actually pet them if you're gentle. But these are also carry their pollen on the hind leg, and will sometimes see a huge mass of pollen on it seems an absurd amount of pollen on their hind legs. And so they are sometimes referred to as chap-legged bees because they look like they're wearing chaps. Sometimes you see them coming back and you think that they've just got back from the county fair because it looks like just a mass of cotton candy on their back legs, but that's just the pollen that they're hauling around. Carder bees, and this is one that's not native, and I'm just throwing in here because the European carder bee is one that we find in our gardens in particular, and they're very distinctive, have very close association with certain plants like lamb's ear, and they collect their downy hairs from plants and use that to make their nests in the tunnels. And that lower right photo, you can see where the hair has been scraped off that leaf of the lamb's ear. And the upper right photo is a male. And you see it has these sharp spines on its rear end because they're incredibly territorial, and they will claim a patch of flowers and then chase other males away because they want to mate with the females. And they hover, and you'll see them, they will hover in front of you, and they will sometimes headbutt you, believe it or not, which is a really bizarre behavior, but they don't have a stinger. Male bees don't have a stinger, only female bees have a stinger, so that you're not going to get stung. It's just an unnerving thing to have a bee trying to stare you down and chase you away. And then the last group of bees that I'm touching on are the cuckoo bees, because despite this image that bees have of industry and hardworking, busy as a bee and all that other kind of stuff, 15, maybe 20% of our bees are not so industrious, and they don't make their own nests, and they will sneak into the nests of other bees and then lay their eggs in the nest. And when their eggs hatch out, they then eat the food that the host bee left. But you will see some of these are fairly obvious, and around here, the two on the left there, the upper one is the Sphacodes with that distinctive red body, and the lower one is the Nomada bee, obvious because they're either black and yellow or red with yellow markings, and those are the two that we see most frequently around here. That was a very quick guide. There are some other books out there that will, if you want to delve more deeply into the groups of bees and their natural history. Attracting Native Pollinators has a series of profiles of the different bees in them. The book in the middle there, The Bees in Your Backyard, is just a fantastic book, and it will allow you and help you to identify your bees to a greater level of accuracy than others, but also has a lot of really great biology and natural history information about what they need. And then the one on the right there, Paul Henson's Buzz, is just a really nice, easy read, a great introduction to pollinators, natural history issues, etc., etc. And it's just great background. So. And I'm going to have to hurry up because I am watching my watch here, and I realize I spent too long nerding out on bees. Conservation, what can you do to support bees? The first thing I say is backyard beekeeping is not bee conservation. If you want to help bees, you should have habitat. Bringing another box of a non-native bee into your neighborhood is just going to add bees needing to feed on already degraded areas. There are reasons for having honeybees. Honey, intimate relationship with a fascinating insect. Those are reasons, but make sure you're beekeeping for the right reason and not because you somehow want to save the bees, because bee conservation means providing what the bees need in the landscape. And so bee conservation is focused on habitat, making sure the bees have secure nest sites. Those nest sites need to last for a year because the bees are dormant for that long. The flowers that they need foraging in the local area, pesticide-free environment so that the flowers will be safe to them. We can be protecting existing areas and creating new habitat. Our natural areas, though, nature parks, creek corridors behind our houses, snaking through our towns, vast areas of prairie, all these kind of things, we should be fighting hard to protect these and maintain them in the best condition, because these are providing reservoirs. These are the areas that support, the bees that we need and that can move gradually into our neighborhoods to reclaim depopulated areas. We can also look at our landscape in our neighborhoods, and you'll find all these little piecemeal areas, roadsides, parks, school playing fields, rooftops, bioswales, power line easements, creek corridors, and our gardens. All of these areas can support bees. Although we may often think of wildlife needing corridors, you read and hear about people talking about, oh, we need a corridor for the wildlife, for the animals to move through, for the birds to fly along, etc., etc. Bees are small and can move in a more diffuse way across our landscapes, which means that what you do in your garden is significant. What you do in your garden and what your neighbor or the folks in the next block do is significant, because the bees are moving from patch to patch. And I know it seems silly to say that small patches are significant because bees can fly, but it's true. And because bees can fly, it means that they can use multiple different patches across your neighborhood. So you don't have to have necessarily to have all the flowers and all the nest sites in one area. You can have a partial habitat. You can have an area that has bare soil for the bees. You can have snags, in creek corridors where the bees can nest. You can have the flowers on the roadside in your garden. And this is just a conceptual diagram that illustrates that, how bees can have foraging areas in one place and nesting sites in another. And sometimes that happens all in the one place, because bees don't necessarily able to fly a long way. In essence, the smaller your bee, the less far it will fly. And if your bee is only 1/10 of an inch long, it's only going to fly 100 yards, maybe less. And so you need to be providing all of this habitat in a relatively small area. And this is just a way to show how a bee might be working the different patches of habitat in the landscape. The pink root shows a cavity nesting bee, such as a leafcutter or a mason bee or a small carpenter bee. And the green one shows a ground nesting bee, longhorn, sweat bee, metallic sweat bee, mining bee, and so on. But obviously they're not in isolation from each other. They're overlapping and all using the same patch. But you can see how it could be nesting in one garden and then moving to another garden, or the community garden, or the park, or the roadside, or the wherever else it can find the flowers. And so providing foraging patches. Now I've just realized I'm like, oh, I've got this in the wrong order, because nest sites, foraging patches, pesticides, but for some reason I'm going to talk about foraging first. We should be protecting the areas that we've got, and we should be expanding those, and that's why gardens can be so important. There are lots of things to think about. You can think about the color of the flower. Bees have color vision, and they see a spectrum about as wide as to what we see, but they don't really see red. To them, the way their eyes work, red and green are the same color. And so you can imagine it's not very easy to see, a red flower against a green leaf if it's the same color. in their eyes, but they see yellow, they see white, they see purple, and they also see ultraviolet. So their vision is shifted into a spectrum that we personally can't see. You can have a diversity of flowers because you could have 3, 4, 5 dozen bees in your garden, and all of those have different flowering needs. You have a diversity of flowers, both flower shapes and flower species. We try to support flowers or provide flowers that will support the bees from February through to October. And it is possible to have bloom all through that period. And it doesn't necessarily need a large area. Native species are better. Process of coevolution. Bees and flowers have evolved alongside and adapted to each other. The flowers provide the nectar that attracts the bees and the other insects and other pollinators who then move the pollen around. The bees have adapted to efficiently collect and transport the pollen and drink the nectar. So together, you know, our native bees are better adapted to native flowers. And there is studies that demonstrate that native flowers will support a greater abundance and a greater diversity of native bees than non-native flowers. We also, like when choosing flowers, think about drought tolerance these days. We all know our climate is shifting. I mean, goodness, it was almost 80 degrees today here in the Portland area. We haven't had significant rain in months. So we're trying to think about flowers that will survive with minimum support. And we can also think about the last item here is landscape context, takes you back to that idea of partial habitats. You know, if you've got a creek corridor just down the road that has snags in it, that's fantastic nesting sites. But does it have the flowers later in the year? So you could be looking at what there is just down the road, and then figuring out the gaps and focusing on providing flowers to fill those gaps. And so to just swiftly just give you an idea of some great flowers, Oregon grape is a lovely plant to start the year. The willows are one of the key pollen and forage sources for early emerging bumblebees and mining bees. We go into the spring and we find steeplebrush, lupins, later in the summer, plants like Pearly Everlasting, and then we head into the era of asters now. I mean, I still have asters blooming in my garden. In wetlands, Biden's Begotix, the common name, is a wonderful wetland plant that blooms late in the year and provides a huge nectar source as a late season boost. And a shout out for thistles. And I don't mean Canada thistle or bull thistle or milk thistle. This is not a shout out for problem invasive weeds, but our native thistles. They are hugely rich in nectar. You know, if you like monarchs, one of the best plants to fuel the fall migration are thistles. So native thistles are wonderful. Although I said that native plants are better for native bees, there is a case for non-native plants, in particular in gardens and in formal landscapes. Plants from the eastern part of the United States, like purple coneflower, is a good one. We can also bring plants up from California. You know, since we seem to have a California climate, maybe we should be trying California plants. And then plants like the Spanish lavender, the French lavender at the bottom there, from outside of this continent. But the right plants can help fill the gap and can provide particularly nectar. And that's French lavender is an incredible source of nectar that supports bumblebees in the spring. When you're choosing plants, unfortunately, in the process of developing flowers that are attractive to people, you know, with extra petals to them, for example, different colors, in the process of hybridizing and developing new cultivars and new varieties, inadvertently some of these plants have lost the ability to produce nectar and pollen. So although it might look glorious, it's a barren buffet as far as the pollinators are concerned. So we always recommend that people select older varieties of plants, and some cases, some of the heritage, the herbs, are also fabulous. And it's not easy to be able to say which ones are better than others, but if you go to a garden center, and these days most people are selling flowers in bloom, so just walk around and then see which ones the bees are visiting, and that'll be a good indication that the bees like those. And we can also be looking at lawns as another place where we can be introducing some forage. Personally, I'm never going to win like the Scots Man of the Year award for my lawn because I don't use products on it. And so you can sow, and you can buy seed mixes for an eco lawn these days, or just what you might call benign neglect. So it's not an abandoned weed patch. You're tending it, you're mowing it, you're taking care of it, but you're allowing plants that are not problematic to bloom in it. Self-heal, Dutch clover, bird's foot trefoil. There are all sorts of plants that will live very happily below the mower and yet will give you some more bloom. So nest sites, again, keep what you can, bare ground for the ground nesting bees, snags for the tunnel nesting bees, but you can also move on to create these places. But the bare ground doesn't need to be a lot of bare ground. This is a photograph here, and there's only about 6 or 8 inches between the edge of the concrete drive and that lump of basalt, and you'll see just tucked underneath the edge of that basalt, you can see the nests of those ground nesting bees tucked in there. So it doesn't need to be large areas of bare ground, they just need access to the soil. You can create nest blocks, a piece of wood, drill holes between 3/16 and 3/8 inch diameter, make them 4 to 6 inches deep as you can get. And the reason for that is that the cells that the tunnel is divided into, the female bee, the more cells you can get into a tunnel, the more bees that will be produced. And the female always, there's a few male bees that emerge at the last cells at the front of the tunnel. And so if you have a short tunnel, there's fewer female bees. And so the deeper your tunnel, the more females are produced. You can also use hollow stemmed plants such as bamboo or common reed. Just bundle them up, put them somewhere, and the bees will find them. And you can see here, these are 2 of those examples of artificial blocks. The top one has been, all the tunnels are blocked with chewed up leaf pieces, and the lower one is a mason bee, and all those tunnels are blocked off with mud. So this really is an effective tool. You'll also be supporting more than just bees. These are 2 examples of wasps, native wasps, solitary wasps, that will also occupy. So if you see a block with pieces of grass sticking out, you've got a grass carrier wasp moving in there, and they're good to have around and not at all aggressive. And if you've got the right kind of soil to support ground nesting bees, you'll also find wasp species like the golden digger wasp here. Incredible, beautiful, fascinating insects to watch. You can make bumblebee nest boxes. There's no real fixed way on doing this. A wooden box, 6-8 inches cubed, a bit of soft nesting material like upholsterer's cotton, or snipped up bits of wool or dried moss or something like that. Plastic pipe as a bit of an entrance tunnel there. You're kind of mimicking a mouse hole or a chipmunk nest. Make that, you can tuck it away into a sheltered corner somewhere out of the way. Nice project. Very satisfying to make, but not many of them get occupied. Probably only 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 are ever occupied. So you're actually better off making sure that you have untidy, tumble down areas where mice and chipmunks and others can make their nests, and the bees will be happy there. And another thing about nesting, thinking about that entire life cycle, you can also just make sure you have some good chaos. keeping the leaves, because bumblebees will overwinter underneath a pile of leaves. There are other things that will live in there, and all sorts of goodness can come from leaves. You can keep the stems that don't clean up your garden at this time of year, leave stems standing, and then trim them down in the late winter, and you'll be creating these kinds of hollow stems in places where our bees can be nesting. I'm going to touch briefly on pesticides. For most gardens, there isn't really a need for pesticides. A lot of our pesticides are used for cosmetic reasons, because we don't want, you know, holes in our leaves or whatever. And if you want to have pollinators, you're going to have to accept that some of your plants are going to get chewed. Sometimes it will be leaf cutters or other bees collecting leaf materials. Sometimes it's going to have butterflies. If you want butterflies, you need to feed the caterpillars, for example. So you need to be prepared to have holes in those leaves and have chewed plants. The problem with pesticides is it's like a no-brainer. Insecticides in particular are designed to kill insects, which means that they are harmful to our pollinators, whether that's a fly, beetle, butterfly, a bee. And in particular, the neonicotinoid group of insecticides and some other systemic ones, and there are now newer products coming out with names that I just can't pronounce. But they're fantastic from the perspective of pest control, because the toxin gets inside the plant, and the plant itself is toxic and not just a layer on the outside. But the problem with these systemic insecticides like the neonicotinoids is that means the nectar and pollen is now toxic. And it is harmful to bees. It's not necessarily going to kill them outright, but it does impact their behavior, their ability to navigate, their efficiency at foraging, their reproductive ability. And so these are problems. And even if you're carefully following all the instructions, you know, on what's usually referred to as the bee label, the bee labels are typically based upon research using the honeybee, and the honeybee has a totally different lifestyle and natural history from our native bees. And so it might help. You might be able to protect honeybees, but not our native bees. And unfortunately, these days, pesticides have become a problem that's beyond the gardener some of the times, because the plants are treated with insecticides in the nursery. And so that plant that looks beautiful, when you buy it from the garden center, the toxins are traveling in time and in space, because the toxins can remain within the plants and remain active for weeks or months. And you're taking them from the plant, and you're taking them into your garden. So we encourage people to seek out businesses that sell pesticide-free, insecticide-free plants, and what we refer to as bee-safe nursery plants. And you'll find information on our website about this. You can also, you know, heavily water the plant for the first few weeks, and that will help flush out some of these toxins. You can also trim all the flowers off in the first summer if you want, or you can cover it with a fine mesh to stop the pollinators from getting to that plant. So there are ways to you know, ameliorate these problems, but unfortunately, the way that the plants are grown mostly now, these insecticides have become broader problems. Or you can use alternatives. You can say you can just not use insecticides, and you'll find that all sorts of other critters will turn up in your yard and will eat the aphids and will control your problems. You know, lady beetles, flower flies, syrphid flies, pollinators, and predators. There are beetles that will eat pests, and some of them eat problem weed seeds too. So in creating a pollinated garden, you're creating an entire habitat that will support a much wider range of wildlife. And in time, you will find you have a sense of balance. You might have aphids turn up and start eating, you know, a lupin, say. but very quickly, the lady beetles, the syrphid flies, the predators will find those aphids and munch their way through them and solve the problem for you. So wrapping up, you can, we have the Bring Back the Pollinators campaign and the Pollinator Protection Pledge. If you go to bringbackthepollinators.org, will take you to a page on the Xerces website. And you can sign the pledge: pollinator friendly flowers, nest sites, avoid using pesticides, and share the word. And sometimes sharing the word is as simple as putting up a sign that explains that you're creating a pollinator habitat. And the reason why we say share the word is because word of mouth, neighbor to neighbor, peer-to-peer conversation is a really powerful, effective way to get more people involved, because the more gardens that we can have change, and it doesn't have to all happen at once, it's an incremental process, a little bit now, a little bit next year, a little bit the year after. But the more gardens that can be changed, the better our landscapes will become. If you want to do something at a community level, we have the Bee City USA program, where you can get together as a community and make a commitment to, again, create habitat, avoid pesticides, talk to people, and your whole community can become affiliated and registered, certified as a Bee City. And we have something similar for Bee Campus USA for universities and colleges. And in fact, Eugene is a Bee City, and University of Oregon and Lane Community College are Bee Campus. So you already in Lane County have a great representation and a lot of people doing good stuff. You can get involved with community science, because once you've created this amazing habitat, bringing in all these bumblebees and other stuff, you can contribute sightings through websites and apps that help build knowledge of the species that are out there, and from that inform conservation work. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you. There are books out there. Some of these are produced by Xerces Society. There are other books out there, but other people, just because it's Xerces doesn't mean it's the only thing you should be reading. But hopefully these are really useful. 100 Plant to Feed the Bees will help you find the right kind of flowers. There's lots of information out there for you to follow up. You can also go to our website, which is xerces.org, xerces.org, and you'll find a load of fact sheets you can download as PDFs and print out. Detailed plant lists, guidance on how to create nest sites and overwintering, how you can find and encourage nurseries to produce bee-safe plants. All sorts of materials that are out there allow you to dive in at all sorts of different levels more deeply. We also have a YouTube channel that you can go to. So if you find it easier to listen and view as a preferred learning style, you'll find a lot of information out there on our YouTube channel. You can follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and we share hints and tips, we share resources, we share announcements, and you can ask questions, and we try and answer all the questions as best we can. We are a donor-supported organization, so my boss would not be happy if I did not say this. So, I mean, if you felt like you wanted to support Xerces Society and our work, that would be wonderful. Thank you. And the very end, I realized I spent too long nerding out about bees, and I apologize for taking rather long, but I'm happy to hang around for as long as needed to try and answer your questions.
Thanks, Matthew. That was great. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much. So let's see what's in the questions real quick. Do you recommend planting milkweed for monarchs in Portland? I've seen conflicting information.
I don't know if I have the absolute answer on that, because I've also seen conflicting information. There are some people who think that milkweed is not naturally occurring in the Portland area. They think that milkweed didn't really, they made it up the Willamette Valley, but didn't naturally get over the hills and into the Portland area. But also I know that occasionally monarchs pass through. So, you know, I mean, I don't think there's any harm in planting milkweed as long as it's native milkweed. And so essentially for the Portland area, that means showy milkweed, Asclepias speciosa, because there are other milkweeds, and there's a distinctly nasty tropical milkweed, which you can find in it's an easy one to get hold of because many garden centers have it, but it's a bad one for monarchs, and it's not one that I would encourage anybody to plant. But milkweed is a fantastic plant all of its own, which will support more than just monarchs. Obviously, monarchs are few and far between. Real problem with monarchs in the western states, and we get very few monarchs coming up the Willamette Valley. Portland was every few years, and I don't know when the last time a monarch was really seen in Portland. So I by all means plant milkweed. It's a beautiful plant. I have it in my own garden. It's a beautiful plant, and if the monarchs do pass through, then hopefully they'll find it.
Are dragonflies pollinators?
No.
Okay.
They're fabulous, but not pollinators.
In the springtime, sometimes I see what looks like a very large bumblebees, quite black, almost shiny. Are those queens?
No. If they're quite shiny, they are actually probably large carpenter bees. The large carpenter bee, it's Lane County is about as far north as the large carpenter bee gets in Oregon, or certainly in the Willamette Valley. And they are as big as a bumblebee, but those probably are the large carpenter bees. And I'm a little bit jealous because they're very cool, but they don't come all the way up to where I live. But those, particularly if it's black and shiny, then it's going to be a large carpenter bee.
If we do need to disturb bare soil that has been left alone for many months or years, what time of year would be the best for bees that might be nesting in it?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Depending on the bee species, and they could be a foot or more down. So the chances are that if you're digging, you're not going to be disturbing them. But there are other bee species that may be only nesting 6 inches down. And so, I mean, unless you know for sure that there are bees nesting in it, I wouldn't worry too much. I would suggest that you disturb the smallest area necessary. But I think inevitably, if you're going to be planting plants, you're going to be bringing in another benefit to bees. And so there's going to be some disturbance.
Okay. Is Xerces Plants Inc. in Portland have a working relationship with the Xerces Society?
Which one was that, sorry?
Xerces is Zerca plant.
I don't know, I'm afraid. That's not one I've heard of.
Okay. What should the nest blocks be set? When should the nest blocks be set out for the bees if you're making them available?
You can put them out anytime you want. It doesn't really matter when you put them up. I mean, the bees will be active from March onwards, so that you may not see any activity around them. But you can put them out any time. And I realized I was moving fairly quickly, so I didn't really linger on where or how to put them out. And I think as well, now, because mason bees have become so well known, a lot of people are thinking about mason bee blocks and the need to clean a block and all of that, which means that you are taking the block in removing the cocoons and through the winter, storing those somewhere during the winter, and then cleaning out your block. And most of the bees you can't really do that to. You can't get the bees out of the tunnel. And it's a very particular system that's been developed for commercial pollination and rearing of orchard mason bees specifically, and also leafcutter bees, which it's possible to do this with. But for most of the bees, you can't really clean the tunnels like that. So the way to handle it is, to be perfectly honest, over a period of about 2, maybe 3 years, any block you put out once it's occupied is not going to be producing more bees after 2 or 3 years, and it's going to be pretty grungy. And so the thing to do is either take that block down and dispose of it, because at that point it's full of disease and parasites and all sorts of nasty stuff, and just throw it away so that you get rid of the problems, and then make sure you've got a fresh block that goes up. Or you can take that block down and just re-drill the holes with a drill of the same diameter, which seems a bit messy, but that will just pull out all the old nest cells, and then you can use a mild bleach solution to soak the holes and allow those to dry out. And then, if you are doing that, if you can put a fresh block out every year, then there'll always be something new. And then after a couple of 2-3 years, you can take an old block away. And I say either dispose of it or clean it out and put it back up.
Okay, thanks. Yellow jackets, are they pollinators or just pests?
Yellow jackets can be pollinators because they are seeking out sugar. Most of the sugar they take probably comes from fruit or sometimes soda, but they do visit flowers for nectar, and in doing that they can move pollen around. But yellow jackets, just doing what yellow jackets do, they do eat a whole lot of what you might call pest species. And so they are very good predators to have in your garden. They just like to share your food with you, unfortunately.
Okay. So people are asking about neem oil, BTU, and diatomaceous earth. Are they harmful to bees, or what's your thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean, anything that's been designed or is used to kill insects is a potential challenge for pollinators. Some of these are less harmful, and there are ways in which you can use them so that they will be, their impact will be ameliorated. So frequently, you can put out treatments in an evening, so that then the product will have a period of time when it's going to be a highest hazard to the pollinators, but for most of those it's only while the product dries, and so it's only a few hours. And so if you're putting it on overnight, then by the next morning the product will be dry and will be less of a risk to bees visiting the plants.
So is mulch a problem for ground nesting bees?
It can be. It does slightly depend on the type of mulch. Some of the bigger mulch, the big bark chunk type mulches or stones that are put down, there are gaps between those and the bees can get in. But if you're having bark dust or a really dense layer of bark chips or whatever that are going in, then it will block the access to the soil that the bees need. In the case of that, we know that there are benefits of mulch from weed suppression, and therefore using less herbicides, and also keeping in moisture and reducing the need for irrigation. So, you can use mulch where it's necessary, but you might have a flower border, for example. Just don't mulch the whole thing, only mulch the bits that need it, so that you're leaving some areas of bare soil that are accessible.
When watering, how do we avoid harming ground nests?
The clever thing about ground nests is they're remarkably resistant to water. As you might expect around here, I mean, particularly Western Oregon, with how much rain we get. I mean, if you think about it, the ground's going to be saturated, ideally will be saturated for a long period of the year. And so the bees can, their nests in the ground, they will survive. And I don't know if you remember the photograph I showed of the nest cell in the ground. You probably saw that it was dark color and all shiny on the inside. And that's because the bee can exude a slightly oily substance, which it rubs into the soil, and it polishes the inside of that soil. So it's very shiny and resistant. And there are some bees that create like kind of a polyester, a cellophane-like material and completely waterproof. And so they can actually live in creek banks and will survive floods and all sorts. So the bees are naturally adapted to coping with wet soil.
Are carnivorous plants a problem for native pollinators? We are in Southern Oregon where there are native carnivorous plants.
I wouldn't say that they're a problem on a big scale, but for individuals, sure, but they do need pollination. So a lot of the carnivorous plants, I mean, like pitcher plants, for example, and is it the pitcher cobra plant? I think they have down on the coast there. I mean, they're adapted and they're probably pollinated by flies, and so the flies can get it in, but some of them end up being eaten, but there are ways for the flies to get back out because the plant wants to be pollinated. So no, I mean, yeah, if a pollinator visits and gets trapped, then yeah, it's going to be a problem. But if you look at the real scale of these things, carnivorous plants and the few the insects that they eat in their life is nothing like the scale of losses from habitat loss or insecticide use, or even some of the shifting climate patterns we're suffering from now.
Okay. Is it true that milkweed is poisonous to dogs and cats?
I honestly don't know whether it's poisonous to dogs and cats. I mean, milkweed can be poisonous to cattle and horses, but I don't know if, I mean, cattle and horses are herbivores, so they might be eating. I don't know whether dogs and cats are likely to eat milkweed. And even for livestock, milkweed poisonings typically occur when the rangeland is overstocked and there's not much else. Livestock don't seem to want to eat milkweed. They only eat it when there's not many options.
Can walking on dirt paths hurt nesting bees?
No, in fact, dirt paths are some of the best places to find nesting bees. They seem to like the packed soil. So when I go walking, I'm frequently walking around like this. So I'm not always seeing what's around me.
Okay, here's a long question. We watched a black bee look like an image of a cutter bee mount another black bumble looking bee, and then we thought we were watching mating. However, when the bee that was bound, the other flew off, the other bee stayed stuck to the plant. Later, we realized that the bee was dead and stayed where it was slain. What bee would kill another bee? Does this sound like a leaf cutter bee behavior?
There are some bees that will kill other bees, like the carder bee, the male carder bee. That's why it has such sharp spines. It will attack other bees that it's encroach on its territory. And they are black, but with yellow stripes. So maybe that was a possibility. I mean, there aren't that many bees that will kill other bees, and certainly not purposefully, but there are other reasons why a bee might be dead. Sometimes, I mean, I've seen bees on flowers and gone in for a close look thinking like, oh, how lucky am I? And then I discover it's a dead bee, but there are crab spiders on the flowers, and crab spiders can change their color to match the flower. So they lurk there and they will happily take a bee. And so there are other reasons why you might find a dead bee on the flower. And so, I mean, again, it's one of those questions where I can't really give a really direct, confident answer because I didn't see the specifics, but it is possible that there was a bee that was already dead, and male bees are not very picky. They will try their luck anywhere they can, and so the bee may have already been dead.
Okay, 2 more and then that'll be it. Can you briefly describe the bee fly and how they fit into the bee realm?
Great question. The bee fly looks a lot like a bee. That's why they're called bee flies. They are round and hairy, and some of them are striped. I mean, there's several different species that we find in this area, but one of them, the more commonly encountered one, is pretty fat and hairy. They are pollinators themselves because they go to flowers to drink nectar. That's their flight fuel. Many of the bee flies are actually parasites on bee nests. And so you will sometimes see, particularly for mining bee aggregations where you get really large numbers, you'll see these bee flies flying low around. And as they go, they kind of dip their tail. And each time you see them dip their tail, they're dropping an egg. And so they fly low and they try to drop eggs into the nest entrances, presumably in the hope that then those eggs will end up down in a brood cell. But that isn't a problem, because if you have a big enough population of bees to attract something like a bee fly as a parasite, it's actually a really good indication that you have a very healthy population of bees, because it's abundant enough to support parasites, which might seem like a odd approach to take, but it's the same with the cuckoo bees. If you start seeing cuckoo bees, you have a robust population of their host species too.
Great. So the last comment here was, just wanted to say that Clark College is a certified bee campus. Yes,
it is. They're one of the more recent campus to become affiliated, and they have a. And I saw Stephen Clark was mentioned there. He's amazing. He's managed to get a sabbatical, and he's spending his sabbatical creating an entire pollinator conservation plan for the campus. And it's fabulous.
Well, great. A lot of thank yous and great presentation.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I apologize for talking for too long. I should be better than that. So.
No problem.
I want to thank you, Matthew. From all the questions, obviously, there was a lot of interest in your talk tonight. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I want to thank everyone that participated in listening to this seminar. And I want to wish everyone a very pleasant evening. So good night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.